Okay, well, this is the last safety one. This is more fun stuff. Radiation. Uh, if you remember, I had a chart that showed the entire uh, electromagnetic spectrum from DC to infinity. And about the middle, I guess he came back, is visible light. Below visible light is non-ionizing radiation. Above visible light, when you get into ultraviolet and X-rays and gamma rays and whatever comes next, that's ionizing radiation. It has enough energy to disrupt the DNA in your cells. It's the same as nuclear radiation exposure is the same kind of deal. It's disrupting your cells. So ultraviolet is where that starts. So enough exposure, laying on the beach for 8 hours, you're going to have some serious cellular damage. And as you go up to the higher energy levels, it can kill you. Maybe not instantly, but long term. And that's why what we call radiation poisoning does. So fortunately, we're down in the non-ionizing radiation, but it can still cause heating and other cellular damage. I mean, you can get enough that could affect the soft tissues like your eyes, brain, stuff like that. So you have to worry about your exposure when you're transmitting. So what type of radiation are radio signals?
Delta.
Right, non-ionizing. How does RF radiation differ from ionizing radiation?
Alpha.
Alpha. So they came up with these exposure limits. Actually, I think the IEEE actually does the chart. So as a station licensee, and when you get an FCC license, you actually get two effectively. You have a station license and an operator license. As the station licensee, you're responsible for the station and to ensure that no one is exposed to radiation beyond the acceptable limits. So in order to see whether you comply, you can do calculations based on the FCC bulletin, which Jack has done, right? Was it hard?
No, it took a little time to interpret the text of the bulletin, and I basically put that into a spreadsheet so I could populate the data points, and then it's doing the calculations that the bulletin said. So I made it simpler by creating a spreadsheet, which I'm willing to share if someone needs.
There's online calculators that you can use. The ARL website has one, and you just plug in the appropriate numbers, and it gives you how far away you have to be within the acceptable limit.
That's easier.
Yeah. Or
I've done both, and actually the ARRL calculation is more lenient than what I found. I'm supposed to be doing the same thing, but
yeah,
it says I can be further away from the radiating source than what I've come up with by trying to follow the Institute of 65. But at least I can demonstrate that I've
right.
Either way, I'm safe, and other people are safe.
You can also actually go out and measure if you had a calibrated field strength meter, which would be an expensive piece of equipment, so not everybody would have access to that. But you could, if you had one, you'd go walk around and take measurements, see what the field strength is and where you exceed the limit. any of those methods are acceptable, but you have to do it. And anytime you change anything that would affect that, you have to redo it. So in other words, you put up a different antenna, or you bought a power amplifier, or change something, anything that would affect the radiation pattern and strength. You're supposed to keep that updated and available for inspection by the FCC inspector should they decide to come inspect you. I don't think it'll ever happen because they don't have enough officers or people, but that's what the rules are. So who is responsible for ensuring no person is exposed to RF energy above the FCC exposure limits? Which of the following is an acceptable method to determine whether your station complies with the FCC RF exposure limits?
Delta.
All of them. One of the factors that you put in, if you're doing the calculator or the bulletin type thing, is the duty cycle, which is what percentage of the time are you actually transmitting? So if you're transmitting half of the time, your exposure can be twice as much because you're only transmitting, and it's the exposure, it's the average amount of exposure. So you can have twice as much exposure when you're transmitting if you're only transmitting half of the time. So it's basically inversely proportional to the duty cycle. If you transmit 10% of the time, then you could have 10 times the exposure while you're transmitting. What is the definition of duty cycle during the averaging time for RF exposure? Charlie. Why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels? Alpha. It determines the average exposure. How does the allowable power density for RF safety change if the duty cycle changes from 100% to 50%? Well, you sure?
Well, Charlie then.
Right. If you transmit a smaller portion of the time, your density can go up. Okay, and it turns out that your body is more sensitive to some frequencies than others as far as radiation exposure. Basically, it's at the 6-meter band is the worst case. So the HF band is normally up to 30 megahertz, allows a lot more exposure than in milliwatts per square centimeter than 6 meters does, or 50 megahertz. And then as you go back up into VHF, UHF, the exposure levels go up also. So it's at the basically 30 to 300 area is the minimum. And I think there's a chart in maybe the next slide. So it's the frequency and the power level, okay, and the duty cycle, which is what's taken into account when you do the amount of exposure. And they rate it in milliwatts per square centimeter. Does it decrease
kind of on each side of that, or are there other?
Well, here's the chart.
Oh,
Okay, and this is 1 milliwatt per square centimeter. Okay, from 30 to 300 megahertz, where 50 is kind of considered the minimum point, although they don't go into any more detail. So for what they call controlled exposure, where who's, the area that is being radiated, you're allowed 1 milliwatt per square centimeter in that 30 to 300 range. As you go up in frequency, you're allowed a higher power density, and as you go lower, you're allowed a higher power density. Now you also see a dashed line that's called uncontrolled, where you've got your beam Yagi pointed and you're running 1500 watts and you're pointed at your neighbor's house. He doesn't know that he's being radiated. Okay, so you're only allowed to give him 0.2 milliwatts per square meter because he doesn't know it.
unless it interferes with his TV or radio.
Yeah, but that's different. But so that's why there's two levels, controlled and uncontrolled. But the main thing is to remember that 30 to 300 is the minimum exposure values. I don't know that you have to remember the 1 milliwatt per square centimeter, but it doesn't hurt. Why do exposure limits vary with frequency?
Delta.
Delta. They say soft tissue. I'm sure that's eyeballs. Maybe brain. I don't know what else is considered soft tissue.
That part doesn't affect some people.
Huh?
The brain part doesn't affect some people.
Okay. At which of the following frequencies does maximum permissible exposure have the lowest value?
Lowest?
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
Bravo. What factors affect RF exposure of people near an amateur station antenna?
Yeah.
All that stuff. All those things are taken into account when you do the calculations. And like I said earlier, you're supposed to reevaluate anytime you change something that affects the radiation that you're putting out. Either you went to a different antenna, so you've got a narrower beam, or let's say a wider beam. Either way, it either increases the radiation density or decreases it. But when you make those kind of changes, you're supposed to reevaluate.
But even like for a given antenna, given power, the mode changes the duty cycle,
Right.
really. But the mode would be if you're doing single sideband voice,
Or you do FT8, which is 50% duty
and
cycle.
then there's CW, Morse code, and they're all different. So that really drives
Right.
the change in duty cycle.
Yeah.
There's really when you change the mode.
So if all you've been doing is voice, and then you decide to learn CW, you'd have to do those calculations because the duty cycle is different. Even though you change nothing else. Which of the following actions can reduce exposure to RF radiation? Alpha. Relocating the transmitter doesn't have any effect on your radiation pattern.
Is she sitting on top of the radio?
And you definitely don't want to increase the duty cycle. How can you make sure your station stays in compliance with RF safety regulations? I'll give you a hint. It's not A.
Bravo.
Never tell the FCC anything.
Right. FCC is the government.
We don't inform them of anything we do.
Okay, so ionizing radiation is basically ultraviolet and above because it has more energy at those higher frequencies. The energy in the electromagnetic wave is proportional to the frequency. The range that we deal with, we only have to worry about basically the heating effects. It doesn't do DNA damage. The station licensee is responsible for essentially anything about the station, not just in the case of RF exposure. As a station licensee, you're responsible for operation of the station, that it complies with all the rules and regulations. There's different ways to do the exposure limit calculations. Like I said, measurement, calculation. I haven't done the bulletin, so I can't really speak to that. But the online calculators like the ARL has are much easier to use.
Yeah, I only did the bulletin because that was before the ERRL calculator came out. So I jumped on it when the rule changed.
Radiation exposure, the human body, is susceptible to radiation at certain frequency ranges, or is more susceptible, I should say. Maximum exposure is lowest at the 30 to 300 megahertz range. That's where it's 1 milliwatt per square centimeter for the controlled, and 0.2 for uncontrolled, or 1/5 of it. All these things, the frequency, the power, the distance to the antenna, the radiation pattern, whether you got a vertical omnidirectional or you've got a Yagi beam antenna, all those things can affect it. And whenever you change anything that affects it, you are supposed to go reevaluate or redo the calculations.